Welcome to Resolving Reality, an independent Irish media platform. This is video episode 9, and I interview Ivor Cummins about nutrition and some of the health problems we are dealing with in the world today. Check out the Fat Emperor podcast and also Ivor's website, thefatemperor.com, using the links in the description. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel, Resolving Reality, and for all our other profiles and platforms, visit our website, resolvingreality.com. Okay, Ivor, good afternoon and welcome to Resolving Reality.
Great stuff, Emmett. Great to be here.
Great. Thanks for taking the time. I've been looking forward to this one because I'm really interested in nutrition, and I've been kind of paying attention to it over the years, learning some little bits and bobs. So not an expert, but looking forward to hearing some new stuff. I know you've been doing some great work with your website and your podcast, The Fat Emperor, and the website is thefatemperor.com. So tell us first of all where you come up with the name for this.
Right. Well, brief history. So in 2012, I got some blood tests that were pretty poor in the liver markers. I won't go into detail. And I went to several doctors because I'm a kind of an expert problem solver. I'm a team leader in problem solving and engineering. I'm a biochemical engineer. So I was very quickly able to look at the markers and where they were compared to the population and realize, wow, I'm way out. So I kind of questioned the doctor and then went to another doctor and another one to get the answers on how serious these were and what I could do to fix them in my diet and lifestyle. And I got very poor answers. So I decided, okay, I'd better go and research myself. So I went to PubMed, ResearchGate, got logons, and I got the last 100 years of published scientific papers on all of these pathways and markers. And within a few weeks, I'd largely worked out that I was taking in excessive carbohydrate. So with further research into cholesterol metabolism, lipoproteins, insulin dynamics, and a whole mass of stuff, I became obsessed with, researching this whole area. And I realized that the Fat Emperor name came up because we've got a fat, obese population. So that was one part of the name. The emperor then represents the emperor's new clothes, because I discovered that researchers for 50 years, many of them were discovering that fat was not really the problem we thought it was, but no one could really say anything. So that was the emperor's clothes. And then the emperor for me as well also represented corporate power, because although the scientists made a mistake about fat back in the 70s and 80s, and they got everything all upside down, industry didn't create that falsehood, but industry certainly was delighted that cheap, nasty vegetable oils were now favored and refined carbohydrate was fine and could be better than eating real food. So I think industry got involved and funded science to keep things going the way they were. So that's kind of the other emperor thing. So that's kind of a summary. That's how the name came together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. I like things with a couple of meanings in there. It's good, it's catchy, and it makes a lot of sense. I think it lays out the mission of what you're trying to do and what you're up against as well. Because as we're definitely going to get into, the whole side of it is health and nutrition isn't just about vitamins and what to eat and dieting and all that stuff. There's a whole apparatus and a structure there in the background, and the corporate interest as well. Like, I was going to ask you about that. I mean, your academic training was in biochemical engineering. So is it typical for people to go from that into your line of work, or was it just the personal interest that kind of pushed you in this direction kind of?
Oh, it was hugely personal interest. So I worked for nearly 30 years as a corporate manager and team leader and problem solver, involved in microfluidic, high volume, complex device manufacture. So I worked mostly on problem solving. So I had all the tools for problem solving, logic, everything else. But when I got these poor blood test markers, I was quite focused on health. I had done triathlons and, I was trying to keep my health good, trying to eat well, because I have 5 children. And, I certainly had an interest in longevity and in not going out early with a heart attack or something like my father did. So when I got this upset with these numbers no one could explain, I immediately went into problem solving mode and figured, okay, I'll apply all my expertise to this problem. Because with a biochemical background, this is just another complex problem. I've done this for decades. And sure enough, I jumped in and I could not stop once I started, because all of the answers are out there in the scientific literature. I mean, not in the books and not necessarily in medical school training even. But when you go to the literature as an expert problem solver and follow all the right pathways and put together the root cause diagram, as I call it, you can decode the whole complex mess of nutrition into something actionable. And that's what I did. What I did was, after a few weeks, I had the root causes laid out. Primarily, it was excess carbohydrate and refined carbs and fruit juices I was taking in large amounts. I switched to a low-carb, high healthy fat diet with a lot more meat, fish, eggs, avocado, all that good stuff. Cut out all the breads and pastas, all the refined carbohydrates. And in 8 to 9 weeks, I had dropped 15 kilograms. All my blood markers were resolved. In fact, they were looking excellent. And basically, that's the test of a root cause investigation. You apply the solution based on your hypothesis, and you should dramatically get a result, which I did. So I kind of knew I was correct then.
It's interesting that in your case, see, a lot of people wouldn't have your background, and when they start hitting those problems, they turn to the experts. People who should know better, and they might get led down the wrong kind of path. And so what would be the main areas that you focus on in your work then when it comes to speaking about health? Obviously the ones you dealt with personally, but I mean, do you keep it nice and broad and focus on the bigger issues that we're dealing with as well, health-wise?
Yeah, more and more so. So my first few years, I began to give lectures to 100 or more engineers at a time in the corporation I worked in back in 13, 14. And then one of our guys in there began to record them. So I put them on YouTube. And very quickly, I got a lot of views, and I got a lot of doctors from around the world contacting me and wanting to collaborate. So I kind of got a surprise. And then I realized there was a whole low-carb medical community out there that also understood what I thought I had discovered on my own, right? So I began to research continuously, more and more depth in cholesterol and in all aspects of metabolism, nutrition, and I began to release more and more lectures. And they were quite complex, some of them. But then I was discovered by David Bobbitt, an Irish entrepreneur who founded the Irish Heart Disease Awareness charity. And he had had a similar experience to me, so he began to support me to do more and more research, travel, and more lectures. So again, I was doing a lot of pretty complex stuff, sometimes to basically seminars full of medical people. But in the last year, I'm focused now much more on reaching the masses. So I'm giving lectures and talks and interviews that are higher level, more about the easy to apply solutions to our modern terrible chronic disease problem.
Before we get into some of the details then, looking at the whole picture of, not just Western health, but I suppose global health, modern health issues, what would you say are the main problems that we're dealing with then here overall?
Right. Well, the primary modern problem is hyperinsulin or insulin resistance. So when you are eating foods and living a lifestyle that will tend to make your pancreas release more and more insulin to deal with excessive carbohydrate or glucose, and to get high blood glucose and spikes in insulin and glucose, especially after eating a meal. So the whole thing, if people want to take the top thing to address, it would be insulin resistance, that phenomenon. And basically, this is a form of type 2 diabetes, and people think that around 10% of the population have type 2 diabetes. The reality is, though, that recent figures from America, around 64% of over 45s now are pre-diabetic or fully type 2 diabetic.
Wow.
Yeah, so if you measured with insulin, myself and my co-author, Dr. Gerber, from his practice, and many other colleagues around the world, reckon it's probably 70% plus if you measured their insulin levels, which no one's really doing. So we have a situation now where 70+% of middle-aged adults and over are essentially diabetic. They're metabolically unwell. Whether they appear fat or not fat doesn't really matter. If you measure their insulin levels and glucose, they've got this dysfunction, this diabetic physiology. And that's the massive thing we have to attack in order to help with modern chronic disease.
It's interesting with this type of stuff, you know, because of the way everybody's different. You got genetic factors, you got eating different cultures and all that stuff. That it's probably a tricky thing to diagnose, not even diagnose, but you know, there's all different levels. It's not like you're totally fine and then the next minute you're diabetic. It's not black and white like that, is it? It's kind of there's all different variations. And you know, when we look at Ireland as compared to other Western countries, would you say we are particularly bad in this area? I remember reading an article a couple of years ago in the Times saying that we were one of the most obese groups in Europe. Like, what did you make of that?
Yeah, I saw that article actually. We're heading to the #1 spot, and the UK is pretty disastrous too. We don't have proper figures for Ireland for that insulin resistance spectrum, like you say. I would say we're not as bad as America, but we're following in their footsteps. The Nordic countries and Sweden and those are actually quite a bit better. And then Germany and France are somewhere in the middle. Ireland is certainly one of the worst in Europe, I would say, generally speaking. So we have masses of people with this problem and many other problems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you know, the old, like, you know, how the modern food industry obviously plays a big role in this, and we went from being like an impoverished kind of nation, like a lot of starvation and stuff like that, to and having our traditional agricultural based diets, and then the last few decades it's shot into the refined carbohydrate end of things. Plus on top of that we have the vitamin D problem, right? Because in trying to get the sufficient amount of vitamin D from the sun here is really difficult. Even if you're outside like 365 days a year, maybe you'd be okay then, but otherwise you got to eat a lot of oily fish. So I think we're right up against it. But would you say that we're kind of becoming really typical now as compared to other Western countries overall then?
Yeah, generally the Western countries all have a major issue with what we're talking about. There's no doubt about it. And the key offenders would be, it's not just simply carbohydrate or potatoes or anything, because obviously we ate those before. And there's indigenous populations who eat higher natural real food carb diets along with meat and fish, and they can be quite healthy as populations. So it's really the processed food, I think, if you're to take a key message from this. So refined carbohydrate, simple sugars, which most people know about, and seed oils or vegetable oils, the industrial concoction oils, which are everywhere now. Those three components, I call them the triad of terrible things to eat. The problem is that ultra-processed modern foods are generally stuffed with those three no-nos. So even if you eliminate vegetable oil from a bottle on your counter, and even if you don't eat directly refined carbohydrate and sugars, if you still eat modern processed foods, you're going to be getting lots of those three anyway. So unfortunately, you have to switch to a real foods diet, which is lower in carb, especially if you are in the majority that have an insulin resistance problem. You have to go lower on all carbs now, because that's what makes sense. That's where all the trials have shown you get the best recovery. Lower carbs and then healthy fats. So fish, avocado, olive oil is good, coconut oil's okay, butter's fine, tallow and good quality lards are okay. And yeah, fish, eggs, meat, real foods, along with vegetable carbohydrates like broccoli, cauliflower. Above ground vegetables are low in sugar. They're healthy vegetable carbohydrates. You know, in some ways, if you went, or if everyone went immediately in the Western world to a meat, fish, eggs, and 2 veg diet, we'd see a dramatic collapse in modern chronic disease over 10 or 15 years, you know?
Yeah, and as well, what's kind of related to it as well is that myth that's been perpetuated for many decades now. I believe it started back in the 60s with Richard Nixon and the high fructose corn syrup stuff. You know, when they fats started to become demonized. I think that's the key to a lot of this. So, I mean, how important are fats for health, and how did we get into a situation where they were kind of labeled as the enemy?
Yeah, well, they were in the 60s and 70s. It was seen during the 20th century that cholesterol was somehow involved with heart disease and with atheroma or atherosclerosis, the plaque in our arteries. And over the decades in the middle of the century, there was more and more suspicion around cholesterol, blood cholesterol. And then in the 60s and 70s, Ansel Keys, a researcher, he wasn't a doctor, and I think he was an expert in fish or something. But anyway, he began to put together the theory that dietary cholesterol and dietary fat raised your blood cholesterol, and that was a primary cause of heart disease. So he was a very powerful figure. He got a lot of support, and he did some weak studies to try and demonstrate that he was correct. They were called the 6 and 7 country studies. And long story short, the whole world basically fell in love with the theory that dietary fat and cholesterol would raise your blood cholesterol and give you heart disease. And it was highly flawed. But because the McGovern Commission in the 70s enshrined this into the dietary guidelines and made a high-carb food pyramid with limited fats based on this flawed research, essentially the whole world turned towards that and believed it. And I think industry almost came second. Industry saw what was happening and loved it, because suddenly the message was, well, our cheap as dirt vegetable oils are better than real foods. And our cheap as dirt grains, the lowest cost materials we can ever shove into food, are somehow good now. You know, 6 to 11 servings of bread, which is a refined processed carbohydrate, are now the base of the pyramid. So I think industry then just simply came to the table and more funded science to make sure that those belief systems stayed. And I think that's part of how we ended up. And only now, in the last 5 or 10 years, are studies coming out and being publicized where it's clear that refined carbohydrate is a problem, and that natural, wholesome, evolutionary fatty foods are not really a problem at all, except maybe for small numbers of people who have special sensitivities.
Mm-hmm. And why are fats good then for the diet? They've been demonized a lot, and they've been kind of, people have systematically removed them from their own diets. So not everyone, but some people have, with detrimental consequences. Like, so why are they good for us, and what happens when you remove them, pretty much?
Yeah, so fats are good. All eggs, avocado, and even fatty meats that are grass-fed, well-reared meats, and fish certainly, they're good because they bring in a lot of fat-soluble vitamins. I mean, A, D, E, and we have lots of nutrients, and not just in fats, but in fatty ancestral real foods. They're highly nutrient dense, like meats and fish and eggs. I mean, eggs are a superfood. So you want to be eating these really good fatty foods, and they give you energy instead of taking it from carbohydrates or refined carbs, which tend to be nutrient poor, and they also tend to provoke appetite, provoke blood sugar, provoke blood insulin. So the fatty foods are a great way to replace the genuinely problematic modern processed foods. So they also will give more satiety. And one key effect as well is that if you switch to a lower carb, high healthy fat diet called LCHF, and certainly the very low carb version called keto, after a couple of weeks, you need to adapt. So your body can adapt and you can become a fat burner. So essentially, when eating more healthy fats and less carb, your body builds all the enzymes, millions of copies, to make you tooled up to be a fat burner. And the beauty of that is you can burn your own body fat with ease. So when I switched within a few weeks back in 2012, I realized I could skip meals easily with no major hunger. So a low carb, healthy fats diet allows you to control your hunger, whereas a high carb, modern foods diet drives your hunger crazy over the years and decades. And that's one of the big drivers of obesity. People over time can no longer control their hunger and their appetite, so they just steadily eat more and more and more. But a high healthy fat diet gets you in the opposite state. And that's why humans did not have obesity crises for hundreds of years, except for isolated people. It's because they're eating real whole foods, and their appetite systems and control systems, many hormones involved, they actually work pretty well.
Well, then we're kind of getting into it makes me think of the corporate end of things, because imagine we had a world in the Western world where everybody went keto, and then over the next few weeks, everybody did, and our health levels start going up. Obviously, people are going to be eating less and spending less money on shopping, takeaways, all that stuff. So, I mean, how much do you think that's a factor, the corporate pressure to have people, hooked on the carbs all the time?
Yeah, it sounds conspiracy, but to me it's just business. I'm a corporate guy. Yeah, we have seen so many media articles saying low carb is dangerous, and they're almost increasing in pace now as low carb takes over as mainstream in the world. It's beginning, and keto is coming. So of course it's an enormous threat, in reality, as you described, for businesses that are based on international consortiums of processed food made of refined carbs and vegetable oils. They're going to lose market. So we see the articles, and one recent one was very funny. It was actually keto crotch. And believe it or not, and this shows you how ridiculous it's got, an article went out all over the world with around 40 different images of women. It was actually quite misogynistic. And it talked about keto crotch, where odors could happen down there from eating really low carb and keto. And it turns out that one guy investigated and found a PR company was behind it, and they were funded by Barilla Pasta. So that's just one example, but it's not so much conspiracy, it's just businesses have to have departments to deal with competitive threat. They're often called competitive intelligence, and they have funding and they have to counter things that threaten their business. And one great thing that business has always been able to do is hire PR companies and, manage the message. And so we see a lot of this all the time. But I think the freedom of information on the internet now and the massive network of low carb doctors, professors, researchers, technical people and lay people getting amazing results, that's going to keep going. Yeah.
Yeah, the internet has made a massive difference to things in lots of areas, that free flow of information, and people can make their own choices. And you mentioned about the pasta company, is like they probably come up with the kind of most disgusting thing they could think of related to image, because they know it will get in there, they'll get that reaction, and then that might be effective.
It's classic, as of course, when you're in the brainstorming room of a food company trying to get something that's going to have impact and scare people who have no idea about low carb or keto. Of course, you're going to get stuff like keto crotch. You're not just going to say, oh, low carb, might be bad for heart disease. It's too soft. So yeah, they go for the good stuff. But there's the other side too. I mean, David Bobbitt, who founded the Irish Heart Disease Awareness, who I work on behalf of, he is one of the most successful businessmen in Ireland, and he is a huge corporation. But when he got a calcium scan of the heart back in 2012 and discovered he had enormous heart disease with 3 blocked arteries, and that all of his medicals he passed, and the doctor said he was perfectly healthy, that was all false, he took action. He discovered low carb. He discovered all the things we're talking about. And he also put several $1 million into the Irish Heart Disease Awareness charity. And he's funding me. So that's a case of the right thing coming from big business, trying to save people's lives.
Yes, that other side, that's great to hear. And it just sometimes it just takes one or two to get on board, and then it'll turn things around. And speaking of the medical profession, because they're a big part of this too. When people have health problems, they naturally go to the doctor. People say go to your doctor, and even just from my own interest of years of just bumping into people, talking to and dealing with medical professionals as well, in my own personal life, and having that interest in nutrition, there's very little talk about it. Like, why do you think that is, that diet isn't talked enough about in the medical profession? And like, how come this still hasn't changed yet after everything that's happened?
Yeah, well, the medical profession, the education system is very slow in medicine. And I have many colleagues now in the medical world. In fact, last week in Denver, I spoke and addressed 850 people in a low-carb conference, Low Carb Denver. And it was full of doctors and professors who know this stuff. And they know that nutrition and lifestyle is most of the root cause of modern disease and is the best method of addressing it. However, most general doctors in the education system, they only get a few hours of nutritional training in their degree. And it's just in the last 30 or 40 years become massively focused on pharmacology and medicines. So you learn all the physiology, the anatomy, and you learn a ton of pharmacology and how to address diseases and problems with certain drugs. And that is the whole education. So they know a ton when they come out, but they know almost nothing about nutritional root causes of disease, except for some vitamin and mineral, deficiencies. But that's not really our main issue. So I think that's the problem. And again, the internet is going to, I think when around 7 or 8 or 9 or 10% of doctors around the world grasp what we're talking about and realize how huge it is, I think the whole profession will tip over. We'll have a tipping point. Because right now there's only 1 in 100 or 1 in 200 doctors who will fully understand insulin resistance and how food plays a part in it. But when the numbers get bigger, I think the whole profession will tip, and then we'll see incredible results in human health.
Yeah, it has to change, because the way things are going, it's like, without dealing with the root causes of things, you're just constantly putting plasters on the issue by giving people drugs and all that stuff, instead of sorting them out with at the source. And I think cancer is a good example of that. The rates of cancer we could easily get those down just with diet and lifestyle choices. And if we talk about sugar, because that we've kind of brought it up a few times, but even to go into more detail about it, because it really is the enemy. The way I call it a drug. I think it's the most common drug in the world. I mean, it affects the physiology. You can get addicted to it, and it's everywhere, and it's toxic. So it fits a lot of the definitions of a drug, I think. And so, like, let's start with the names. Like, how many names is there for sugar? Because people forget to read labels. There's like 20 or something names, isn't there, I think?
I think back in 2013, I did a lecture, and I either had 27 or 37 names listed on a slide. It's a long time ago. I can't remember them. But there'll be many names that end in syrup, like agave syrup and this syrup and that syrup. And there's just a load of different names for sugar that don't make you think of sugar straight away. So on some labels, you have to, by law, put the biggest ingredient first, and then the ingredients in order of the amount of them in the product. But sometimes you'll find sugar listed 4 or 5 times under different names. So you're completely fooling people. So the one good thing about European labels is there usually is sugar listed on the little box where it says saturated fat and carbohydrate total and sugar total. So you can see the total carbohydrate and even total sugar in Ireland anyway. I'm not sure about the other countries. So that's the label to look for. The ingredients list, like you say, there's 30, 40 names. It's only going to confuse you.
Mm-hmm. And, with the insulin resistance thing. Now, you mentioned that earlier as being a key problem, and as we said, there's lots of different levels to it. You know, people can be undiagnosed as well for a while, and it can kind of kick them in the arse later. But so how does it work exactly? How does someone get into a state where they have insulin resistance, and what does that result in exactly?
Right. Yeah. Well, that's the big one. So essentially, insulin resistance, if you imagine that your pancreas, when you eat certain foods, has to release insulin, and part of its role, though the insulin your pancreas releases has many, many roles in the body, but part of its role is to keep your blood sugar from rising too high. So if you didn't release insulin and you ate a bunch of sugar, you only have 1 teaspoon of sugar in your whole blood system approximately at any one time. And if you eat 10 teaspoons of sugar in a can of, soft drink, your blood sugar would rocket up, obviously. So insulin keeps the blood sugar down by getting it into the cells and out of your bloodstream. Now, if you keep provoking insulin over time with the wrong foods and demand your pancreas to keep releasing large amounts of insulin to manage the sugar, over time your body can become insulin resistant. And the reason it does this is one part of your body is being forced to release a lot of insulin because it's not your body's fault that you're eating all these carby foods and bad foods, processed foods. So you have to. But the other part of your body is saying, I don't want insulin shoving sugar into my cells because it's going to get toxic at higher levels. So the receptors for insulin that respond to insulin in your body's cells, in your liver and in your muscles begin to downregulate. And that's when you're becoming insulin resistant. Your body is refusing the sugar and refusing to listen to insulin. And hopefully people can see there's a vicious cycle here. You're pushing up insulin, your body's getting more resistant to it, which means you need more insulin then to overcome the resistance, which means even higher hyperinsulin and more resistance required to resist. Wow. So it becomes a vicious cycle. And you mentioned earlier, people who are diagnosed type 2 diabetic, which is insulin resistance. I mean, it's the same thing. Those people, you could measure them 20 years before their blood glucose went absolutely out of control and they were now diagnosed as type 2 diabetic. 20 years before we have the studies, you could measure their insulin and glucose with careful measures and see that they were already essentially diabetic. So it's a long, slow period. But what happens eventually is the wheels fall off the wagon eventually with 20 years of insulin resistance, and then the blood sugar goes out of control. And that's when your doctor sees it. But all the heart damage, arterial damage, all the eye damage, all the damage of diabetes, insulin resistance has been happening for 20 years. Many diabetics go to the grave with a heart attack without ever being diagnosed. You know, in America, I think 11% are fully diabetic. And as I said earlier, another 45% are pre-diabetic. But the thing is, they are insulin resistant diabetic, really. We just don't call them diabetic.
And that's terrible, and for people who are suffering from these problems over such a long period of time, and they don't really know what the answer is, and they're probably like they might be trying to be proactive and do something about it, but that they'll go and have that sandwich or go and have that soft drink or orange juice without realizing it, and the problem is going to keep building up, like you say. And I think the hard part as well with it is the fact that sugar is the most common drug. It's all over the place. And once you start developing problems with sugar at all in your body, trying to stay away from it completely, because, like pastas and breads become a problem. If you've already got a problem with sugar, more of those aren't going to help. And you're just going to keep adding to the problem, aren't you, really?
Yeah, you're fueling the fire, I like to think of it. So recently, Virta Health in the US have used a very low-carb keto diet in people with diabetes. And essentially their view, same as mine, is if you've got insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes, any form of it, which is the majority nowadays of people, you're essentially carbohydrate intolerant. You're intolerant to sugars, refined carbs, breads. You can't manage them anymore. So Virta Health have taken a large group of people in a published study. They've taken away most of the carb, and they have 90% of the people reduced or eliminated their medications for diabetes. So that's how dramatic it can be. The same is happening in the UK. Dr. David Unwin is saving a fortune in medications because he's putting people on a low-carb diet who have diabetes-type problems. So the results are stunning from the trials that are coming out now. Just a low-carb, healthy fats diet manages appetite and takes the pressure off a system that's broken. And you can go off meds, your blood pressure plummets, your weight drops, often very fast, and your heart disease risk is going to go way down. If you're a diabetic, you have 5 to 6 times the risk of a heart attack. Most diabetics die of heart disease. You switch to a healthy, low-carb, well-formulated diet, you get off your meds, and your risk factors are going to plummet. So this is a huge opportunity for the world to take hold of now.
And that's even just dealing with the carb issue and leaning towards more ketogenic, and that will probably sort out a lot of the problems. And as well, do you think, what other solutions then do we have to give everyone a health boost overall? Like, what's your opinion of, say, stuff like we start with intermittent fasting or fasting? Why is that considered a good idea?
Right. Well, intermittent fasting, I love it. I do it. Fasting is good from the biochemistry and the research. Fasting is good for just about everything, right? I know we're told we should eat regularly, and that idea originally came from type 1 diabetics. Type 1 diabetics have no insulin from their pancreas. So if they eat big meals and inject insulin to try and control their blood glucose, a big meal rarely, it gets very hard to control. So the whole belief system that eating a little and regular kind of came from type 1 diabetics many, many decades ago. The truth is that eating fewer meals a day is always healthier. So I eat 1 meal a day or 2, and I eat a very good meal. But I never eat really 3 meals a day, and certainly not snacks. So eating regularly just provokes all your hormones and keeps your body in a state of digestion. And that's not the way we evolved. Fasting brings in autophagy. So if you do longer fasts, like 16, 20 hours, your body begins to use up it's kind of like a garbage truck collecting old cells that are not in great shape. It kind of burns up old junk. It also, by fasting, it lets all your hormones settle right down, and it makes you sensitive to your hormones, like insulin, glucagon, other hormones. Everything settles down. So fasting is a great thing to do, but the one key message for people is you can't eat a high-carb processed food pyramid diet and then decide you're going to go and do intermittent fasting, because your hunger will get you. So like I said earlier, you need to be on a low-carb, healthy fats diet for a few weeks. All the enzymes will be made by your body to burn fats, including your body fat, and you'll become a fat burner. Now you can easily do fasting. So I ate yesterday at 7 p.m. It's now 2 p.m. I haven't eaten anything since then. I probably won't eat till 5 or 6. But I'm sitting here mentally alert, no blood sugar slumps, no fatigue, no problem, because I'm a fat burner, so I can fast easily. So then you can put the two things together, a healthy, healthy fats diet and fasting. And they're two huge ways to improve your health.
I think that's what you brought up, something there that's interesting, that gets people overall when it comes to, when they're trying to improve their health. They go from being in one situation to want to be super black belt, disciplined, all out. So if they're, not in good shape, like, right, I'm going to go to gym 4 times a week, go keto, go intermittent, and it's too much of a stretch for them. And then I always say you're better off to try to set the bar at a reasonable level and go for achievable goals, because it's a psychological war you're kind of having with your own body and your urges, and you need to just take it through the steps instead of just jumping straight in there,
Yeah, no, it's a good point. And myself and Dr. Jeffrey Gerber from Denver published a book last year, Eat Rich, Live Long. It's on all the Amazons. And that's exactly it. We break out all of the key problems, all of the key steps. But diet is 80% of your health. And to be quite honest, it's a better strategy to go to the proper healthy diet for several weeks before you start jumping around the gym. you know, if you get your diet right and some of the effects I described, you'll be able to fast for longer, skip some meals, and you'll become a fat burner, and then you'll have more energy. You will feel a lot better, and that will enable you to do exercise and enjoy it. So it's almost like you add exercise on after a few weeks of fixing the big Pareto problem, which is diet. As we say in engineering, tackle the big thing first that's not too hard to do, and that will enable you to easier add the other good things like more exercise and, you know, any other kind of weight training is very good, or press ups and squats. You don't have to do huge runs. Weight bearing exercise using body weight is very good to build muscle and to make you insulin sensitive. So, and those kinds of exercise of press ups and squats and lift ups can be very easily done even watching a television, you know. These are all things you can do with your own body weight, and over time you'll get great results.
And what's your take on veganism? Because that's something that's, you know, it's a big issue. It's also, it's not just about diet and nutrition. There's the ethical thing, because it's about animal rights, and that's what drives people to do it. So it can get kind of complex. But of course, the way I look at it is your body is a machine, and it reacts to how you're treating it. So it doesn't really care about your opinions about bigger issues and stuff. You know, arguably it'll just do what it does. So what's your take on veganism from a health perspective overall?
Yeah, well, from a health perspective, I mean, I'm fine with the whole morality or ethics and animal, and people have strong beliefs. Like you say, that's a personal business thing. Pushing the diet as healthy, though, you know, it's a very, very restricted diet. And the world always criticizes low carb because it's kind of restrictive. And yet they advocate vegetarian and vegan, which is much more restrictive than low carb. So there's a lot of double talk. In terms of nutrition, if you're vegan, you got to be really careful. You got to take your B12. You got to try and get as many healthy fats as you can from plant sources. They're usually not as nutrient dense. You know, there's a lot of challenges with a true vegan diet when you can't even eat fish or eggs. I would see it as purely something for your ideological beliefs and your ethical beliefs about animals. It really has. There is no human tribe or in the whole of evolution that was vegan. Vegan is a modern phenomenon of the last few hundred years. It's completely new. It doesn't have any basis in evolutionary history or science or nutritional science being better. But people who want to do it for ideological beliefs, that's absolutely fine. Just be really careful and get your supplements.
Yeah, I was thinking, because I'm always interested in the psychology end of it, you know, like just because you're doing something because you feel it's a good thing doesn't mean your body will agree because of science and stuff like that. But I want you to correct me here if I'm wrong, but I've been saying this to people for years that, you know, if again, not as an expert, but, you know, if you want to go vegan, one of the things you got to be careful about is saturated fats, because I believe that they can be good. I don't know, but you've got monounsaturated, polyunsaturated, and saturated fats. I know if you go vegan, you're going to struggle to get some of those, aren't you? I think it's easier to get monounsaturated and polyunsaturated, but maybe not saturated fats.
Yeah, usually plant world items, not so much saturated fat. The kind of key examples, I think, are avocado, and olive has a fair amount. I think it might be 17% of it, olive oil, and coconut oil, of course, they can use, which is saturated fats. So you want a good balance of all the different fats for sure. I think, though, perhaps vegan, the bigger challenge might be certain nutrients like B12 and other animal food-based amino acids, that they'll get much more nutrient-dense food in fish or eggs, and they can't eat any of them. So, yeah, it's a discussion I generally kind of stay out of because it's very specialized and it's very personal, or it should be very personal. You should never be pushing someone to go on a very restrictive diet. It should be just for yourself and your beliefs, I reckon.
Yeah, it does get tricky, all right, because people can get, because of that ethical side of it, people can get kind of, defensive and personal about it. But I think, well, great, if you can help the world around you brilliant. That's a great thing to be able to do, but it's always good to try to help yourself first of all, like to look after yourself and stay in good nick so you can have that longevity and energy levels to kind of to go and do what you want to do in the bigger picture. When we look at, say, the food industry thing, we brought it up a little bit, and I did watch that video you sent me. It was a Dr. Asim I can't remember.
Otra.
Yeah, he was talking about the situation in the UK, I think, and he was talking about the food industry a little bit and the medical profession as well. What about the political side of it? Like the connections between, we kind of touched on it earlier. You've got the food industry involved who are making money, and you've got the political interests as well. Like, we're trying to turn things around and trying to get people to push more towards keto and all of that stuff. Do you see this thing turning around at any point in the future, and how do you think that's going to happen?
Yeah, it's a tricky one, Emmett. Certainly, Dr. Asim Malhotra and Dr. Zoe Harcombe and I went over and videoed the Houses of Parliament address there, and they had Tom Watson, the deputy leader of the Labour Party, was there, and he spoke, and some other senior figures. So it just shows things are moving. Now, the guys did get attacked the following week, I think, in the Sunday Mirror, a massive attack on them, probably based on discomfort at the fact that they were in Parliament talking about this stuff. But Tom Watson lost an enormous amount of weight, I think 90 pounds, and reversed his own type 2 diabetes by going on a low-carb diet, similar to mine or the one in Dr. Malhotra's book. And that's why he's now an advocate. So I think Dr. David Unwin, I mentioned earlier, is doing this in the UK, and he's saving a fortune in medications, transforming his patients' health. And he got an award in the UK, a very big award, maybe 2, for exceptional GP care. So it shows there's green shoots. We're now getting figures around the world, senior politicians. I have a few very, very senior people of large wealth who have contacted me. I won't say their names, but there's a lot of very influential people increasingly realizing the truth in what I am saying here and how necessary it is to fix population health. So we're going to see those people more and more outspoken, and we're going to start getting progress, and there will be pushback. We're going to see more keto crotch articles. We're going to see more articles like the study 2 weeks ago where they said low carb might give you heart failure, or arrhythmia, which is complete junk study. But we'll see more pushback too, because huge amounts of money are invested in a high carb processed food lifestyle. And then, of course, pharma as well are making an absolute fortune on medications, many of which are now treating diabetes, heart disease, and the modern afflictions that are driven by what we're talking about mostly. So yeah, it's going to be really interesting. We'll have to wait and see and keep working hard, I think.
Yeah, and a bit of a struggle, and but of course, you're up against a few things there, but there's more people coming on board, and then all of this as well. The bottom line is that it's about free will choice, because we're living in a toxic environment, and people, there's so much temptation around the place, sugar, all these other drugs, caffeine, alcohol, the cigarettes, everything else, and it's down to people's individuals. They need to want to kind of look after themselves. Like what kind of other advice would you have for people who are trying to turn things around for themselves? And we brought up some of the key lifestyle changes, but what would you say to them to stay motivated and things like that?
Right. Well, what I'd say is that the refined carb, the sugars, the seed oils, are the big 3 to avoid. Then a low carb, healthy fats diet is key. Try and skip more meals as you become a fat burner. And then we've got nutrient dense food. Always think every time you're going to eat something, is this nutrient dense real whole food, or is this not that? The other things are the 4 S's: sleep, stress, supplements, and I can't remember the 4th one, but you got to get good sleep cycles, or you'll get metabolic distress from having poor sleep. And supplements, potassium, magnesium, and K2 vitamin are a few key ones you should try and make sure you're getting. And then exercise. You know, begin to take on more and more exercise as you begin to benefit from the new healthy diet. And you feel much better and you're a fat burner. You're enabled to do more exercise and enjoy it. So they're probably just a list of the big things to do. And I'd have to say as well that there's a big problem in the world with people not being aware that they have heart disease. And the calcium scan, I mentioned David Bobbitt and the Irish Heart Disease Awareness charity I work for. Well, the calcium scan is a quick CT scan of the heart, maybe €200, and you can get that in many centres in Ireland or around the world. And it will tell you, like it did for David, whether you have very high risk or very low risk. If you're a person who, say, is middle risk in the risk calculators or the blood cholesterol, well, many people who are middle risk, where they're not sure whether they're at risk of a premature heart attack or not, if they get a calcium scan in a CT scanner, they'll immediately find out their genuine risk. And a high score means you might be 20 times more at risk of a heart attack in the next 10 years than a low score. But if you've got a high score, the beauty is you can find out, know you're at huge risk, and you can do a lot of what I said and maybe get hold of some meds to stop that calcium progressing. And then you can bring your risk right back down like a low-scoring person. So this is the mission of IHDA, and what I'm now engaged in is to let everyone know about the calcium scan, the CAC score, find out where people are, know their score, and then of course my other role is to let people know what fixes the heart disease, which a lot of what we talked about today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and well, you know, that's great advice, and I know you're doing fantastic work, and you have to just keep putting the message out there. And so just tell us, as we finish up here, tell us about what you've got coming up in terms of public speaking and maybe some interviews, and also just, you know, give us the website again.
Right. Well, the best thing is maybe Google my name, Ivor Cummins, and you'll quickly get my YouTube and my website, thefatemperor.com. You can also go to ihda.ie. But my new podcast series, the last month or two, I've been doing most of the work on. So I have 11 podcast episodes released in video and audio with some really great guests. They're all free. So you'll find that quickly on my website under podcasts. And coming up, we've got a GAA event in early April, a premiere of a documentary that David Bobbitt and Irish Heart Disease Awareness have helped fund. And it's about the calcium scan and middle-aged people and the risk they're at and some of what we talked about. And I have a Utah conference in April. And then in Seattle, I have, or in May, I have Seattle and also Oxford University. I'm speaking to doctors. So there's a lot of things coming up this year around the world, yeah.
That's great. Well, no, it's great to be busy, Ivor, and I think it's a very noble cause what you're doing, because I mean, God, if we don't have our health, like, you know, it needs to be, and there's the struggle where we're still pushing on, trying to change things. So I think it's really noble work. So best of luck with all the plans going forward.
Thanks a lot, Emmett, and great to be here today, and sure, we'll chat again maybe.
No worries. Thanks, Ivor. Thanks for watching Resolving Reality. That was my conversation with Ivor Cummins. Visit Ivor's website, thefatemperor.com, for more information and social media links. Plus, check out the Fat Emperor podcast and subscribe to his YouTube channel. Support Resolving Reality on YouTube, share those videos and subscribe. And also check out the Resolving Reality Radio podcast episodes as well. Visit our website for our social media platforms and all of our other content, resolvingreality.com. So once again, thanks for watching. Until next time, and enjoy Resolving Reality.